Ladies and gentlemen, in the realm of human relationships, emotional investment often serves as a form of currency, an unseen but deeply influential form of psychological capital. When one person consistently invests more time, more energy, more emotional labor than the other, a power imbalance is created, whether consciously intended or not. This imbalance can manifest in subtle ways. One partner defers more often, apologizes more quickly, compromises more easily, or tolerates behavior that chips away at their self-worth. Over time, these small concessions accumulate into a dynamic where one person holds the emotional upper hand and the other operates from a place of insecurity or fear of loss. This kind of imbalance is not always malicious. Often, it develops out of habit or unmet emotional needs from the past. One person may have learned that love is earned through constant giving, while the other may have internalized the idea that attention is owed to them, not earned. Regardless of the origin, the result is the same. One partner becomes emotionally dependent, and the other becomes emotionally dominant, wielding power not through love, but through psychological leverage. What becomes particularly revealing is the moment when the overly invested partner begins to pull back, not out of anger, but from a newfound sense of self-respect. When they stop over-explaining, stop chasing validation, and stop reacting to every emotional cue, a fundamental shift occurs in the relationship dynamic, and this shift often causes profound confusion or even distress in the other partner. Why? Because their perceived control was never about overt authority. It was about emotional predictability. They knew that if they withdrew affection, the other would pursue it. If they displayed disappointment, the other would self-correct. The dependent partner became a mirror, always adjusting, always trying to stay in the good graces of the other. But when that mirror stops reflecting, when the emotional dance halts, it disrupts the very system the relationship was operating under. This disruption is where emotional dependency is most exposed. The person who once seemed indifferent may suddenly become reactive, volatile, or intensely focused. It appears contradictory. Why would someone who seemed disinterested now start showing intense emotion? The answer lies in control. When the ability to influence someone emotionally is lost, it reveals just how much of the relationship was built on asymmetrical power, not mutual connection. In psychological terms, this could be likened to a disruption in a reinforcement loop. Much like in behavioral conditioning, if a certain stimulus such as emotional withdrawal or criticism no longer produces the expected response guilt, apologizing, emotional chasing, the system destabilizes. This destabilization leads to confusion, frustration, and often desperate attempts to reestablish control through intensified behavior, ranging from affection, bombing to guilt, tripping to even manipulation. For the person reclaiming their emotional independence, this stage is critical. It is tempting to interpret the other person's reaction as renewed love or attention, but it's essential to recognize that what's being mourned is not necessarily the relationship itself, but the loss of influence. The emotional dependency previously disguised as indifference is now fully visible. The calm detachment of the formerly dependent partner becomes a mirror that reflects the truth of the dynamic, often for the first time. Understanding this helps illuminate a key psychological principle. Power in relationships is not inherently problematic, but unconscious or imbalanced power often is. When one person's emotional well-being hinges on another's validation or approval, both people are trapped, one in dependency, the other in control. But when emotional investment becomes conscious, deliberate, and balanced, relationships can mature into spaces of genuine mutual respect. This is why detaching emotionally, when done with intention and not as a form of punishment, is such a powerful act. It restores equilibrium, It challenges the patterns that kept both people from growing. And it allows the person who was once emotionally overextended to reclaim agency and begin to interact from a place of integrity rather than fear. Ultimately, when someone stops giving a damn, they are not becoming cold or careless. Rather, they are choosing to honor their own emotional boundaries and stop participating in dynamics that drain rather than nourish. And in doing so, they not only free themselves, they force everyone involved to either evolve or be left behind. One of the most misunderstood aspects of human behavior in close relationships is how people respond to the loss of control over someone they once emotionally dominated. This response becomes particularly pronounced when a person begins to establish and assert their self-respect. At first glance, it might seem as though pulling away, setting boundaries, or refusing to participate in certain behaviors would lead to indifference or disengagement from the other person. In reality, however, it often has the opposite effect. Those who once manipulated through subtle emotional tactics may begin to act irrationally or lose their composure. This is not because they care more all of a sudden. It's because the mechanism that gave them leverage no longer works. When someone sets a boundary or stops tolerating emotionally manipulative behaviors, such as guilt, tripping, passive-aggressive silence, emotional outbursts, or intentional withdrawal of affection, it disturbs a previously unchallenged dynamic. That dynamic may have existed for months or even years, where one person quietly accepted treatment that diminished their emotional safety and autonomy. The moment this acceptance ends and self-respect is introduced into the equation, the imbalance can no longer function as it did. From a psychological perspective, this shift forces the other person into a state of disequilibrium. They may not have been consciously aware that they were exploiting their partner's emotional need for approval or closeness. But once that emotional access is denied or limited, they feel a loss, not necessarily of love, but of control. And for individuals who rely on emotional dominance to feel secure or significant, that loss is deeply destabilizing. Here's where the concept of self-respect becomes central. Self-respect is not about arrogance, ego, or superiority. It is the internal regulation of what one will and will not accept from others. It's not simply drawing a line in the sand, it's reinforcing that line consistently. When someone who has long tolerated boundary, pushing behavior finally enforces their standards, they essentially send a message: I will no longer negotiate my worth in exchange for connection. This triggers what psychologists refer to as a threat to attachment. Many people, especially those with anxious or avoidant attachment styles, respond to perceived detachment with panic. This is particularly true if they've learned to depend on controlling others emotionally in order to avoid facing their own internal insecurities. When you stop being available to feed that emotional loop, their sense of identity or security is threatened. It's not that they loved you more all of a sudden, it's that you were a part of the scaffolding holding up their sense of control. Ironically, this is often the moment when the emotionally unavailable or manipulative partner starts to accuse you of being cold, distant, or uncaring. This reaction is a projection. It's a way to regain control by trying to guilt you back into compliance. If you don't fall for the emotional bait, you are further reinforcing your boundaries, which in turn causes more distress in the other person. This isn't cruelty, this is the natural tension that arises when systems of dysfunction are interrupted. In educational terms, this kind of emotional pushback serves as a learning opportunity for both individuals. For the person reclaiming self-respect, it is a chance to stay rooted in self-awareness and emotional regulation. It's easy to revert to old patterns when someone accuses you of not caring, but emotional maturity lies in understanding the difference between genuine intimacy and manipulative attachment. For the other person, if they're willing to be introspective, it can be a catalyst for growth, forcing them to question how much of their behavior was driven by fear of abandonment or a need to control rather than a genuine desire for connection. What's important to understand is that self-respect doesn't cause chaos, it reveals it. The emotional storms that often follow the establishment of boundaries are not caused by the act of boundary setting itself, but by the exposure of how fragile the previous dynamic really was. People who truly care and who are emotionally secure do not react violently to someone asserting their worth. They adapt, they reflect, and they adjust. Those who cannot handle someone else's self-respect often have yet to develop their own. Therefore, in the context of relationships, the decision to stop tolerating emotional manipulation is not merely an act of self-preservation. It's an act of truth. It lays bare the relational structures that were previously operating in shadow. And in that moment of truth, both individuals are given the opportunity to evolve, either together with a new foundation of respect or separately in pursuit of healthier patterns. Either way, self-respect is the beginning of clarity, not the cause of conflict. In understanding emotional dynamics within relationships, particularly in moments of conflict or disengagement, it is crucial to examine the psychological distinction between indifference and emotional maturity. Many people conflate detachment with coldness or apathy, but in truth, there is a more nuanced and disciplined state that emerges when someone has developed emotional resilience, when they have learned not to be hijacked by every provocation or disruption in the relationship. This isn't an abandonment of feeling, it's the strengthening of internal regulation. The ability to remain calm and centered while another person reacts emotionally is a marker of personal development, not emotional absence. Emotional maturity involves the ability to respond rather than react. Reactivity is often immediate, impulsive, and driven by unresolved emotional wounds. In relationships, it can manifest as shouting, passive aggressiveness, stonewalling, or guilt, tripping, behaviors designed to either punish or regain control. On the other hand, responding requires a moment of internal pause, a checking in with one's own values and standards before any action is taken. This is what it means to be indifferent to chaos, not indifferent to the person, but immune to manipulation, pressure, or emotional baiting. This kind of emotional detachment is often deeply unsettling to individuals who are used to exerting influence through emotional volatility. When they can no longer extract a reaction from their partner, when their behaviors no longer produce guilt, compliance, or chasing, they are forced to confront the reality that their power did not stem from love or respect, but from their partner's unresolved fears or emotional dependency. This moment can be destabilizing, especially if they have built their sense of significance on being the emotionally dominant figure in the relationship. From a psychological standpoint, what's happening here is a collapse of a dysfunctional emotional feedback loop. In relationships where one person is consistently reactive and the other is accommodating, a pattern forms. One expresses chaos, the other absorbs it. This maintains a form of equilibrium, albeit a toxic one. The moment the accommodating individual refuses to engage in that pattern, when they stop absorbing, stop explaining, and stop emotionally chasing, the equilibrium is broken. What follows is often perceived as irrational or extreme behavior by the reactive partner, not because the situation has worsened, but because the strategy that once worked no longer delivers results. This new posture of calm detachment is what often leads to statements like, "You've changed," or "You don't care anymore." In reality, the individual hasn't become uncaring. They've simply stopped allowing themselves to be emotionally manipulated. The restraint they are now showing isn't lack of feeling, it's the presence of strength. And strength often feels threatening to those who relied on weakness in others to feel in control. For the individual practicing this form of indifference, it is important to understand that staying grounded during emotional storms is not about superiority. It's about alignment. They are no longer acting from a place of fear of abandonment, rejection, or conflict. They are acting from clarity, and that clarity allows them to see which dynamics are healthy and which are not, without being swept up in the emotional current. This is why emotional maturity must be taught as a skill rather than assumed as a trait. It is not something one naturally has, it is something developed over time, often through pain, reflection, and the conscious effort to respond rather than react. It involves setting internal standards that are not dependent on the mood or approval of others. When someone reaches this stage, they are no longer seeking validation through conflict resolution. They are content knowing they've acted in integrity, regardless of whether the other person approves. The person who maintains calm in the face of chaos becomes an emotional mirror. Their composure reflects the instability of the other person's behavior, and this can either be a catalyst for growth or a reason for further dysfunction. But either way, the individual has reclaimed their emotional autonomy. They are no longer living in reaction to someone else's mood swings, threats, or emotional withdrawals. They have taken responsibility for their internal world and refuse to allow someone else's chaos to become their burden. In conclusion, indifference to chaos is not the absence of love, but the presence of discipline. It signals the end of emotional dependence and the beginning of relational clarity. It challenges the other person to meet them at the level of maturity or be left behind. In this way, emotional restraint does not weaken a relationship. It strengthens the individual within it, and that strength becomes the foundation for any connection worth keeping.